Hi, today we are going to be doing chapter 10 from my happy place. I love being here. Chapter 10 is called Ascent of the Precipice Injury. Once on track, Much Afraid discovered to her surprise and deep thankfulness that it was not nearly so appalling in actual fact as it had seemed in anticipation. Steep, difficult, and slippery it certainly was, and also painfully narrow. But the feeling of being securely roped to her strong companions was very reassuring. Also, the cordial of the spirit of grace and comfort which she had just drunk from kept her from feeling giddy and faint when she looked over the edge. The thing that she had most dreaded. Moreover, for the first half hour of their ascent, the rainbow still shone above them. And though the shepherd had disappeared from view, Much Afraid had a lovely sense that he was still close beside them. She did not look down unless obliged to do so. But once, quite soon after they had started, she had to wait in a little niche in the rock at one of the difficult places, while Sorrow felt her way forward and Suffering waited in the rear. Just then she looked down and felt very thankful indeed that the shepherd had charged them to start the ascent that evening and not spend the night down below, because sitting on the rocks below were all 5 of her enemies, gazing up at them, grimacing with fury and spite. Indeed, as she looked, she was startled to see Self-Pity, who always looked less ugly and dangerous than his other companions, stoop down and pick up a sharp stone, which he flung at her with all his might. Fortunately, they were already practically out of reach of stone throwing, but the jagged piece did hit the cliff just below her, and Much Afraid was greatly relieved when she felt Sorrow pull gently on the rope to tell her she could now move forward. She remembered the shepherd's warning that she was likely to meet these enemies again when the precipice was surmounted. Though how they would get up onto Mount Injury, she did not know. Only that there must be some other way which they could use. So the 3 of them climbed higher and higher, while the shadows thrown by the cliffs lengthened over the plain below, and the sun went down in a blaze of glory beyond the desert and the great sea. From the height which they had now reached, they could plainly see the western sea, along the shores of which they had just traveled for so long. The track they followed wound up and ever upward, back and forth across the face of the cliff, and though it was crumbling and even broken in some places, Much Afraid was tremendously relieved to find that nowhere at all was it too difficult. Not even at the spot halfway up the cliff which Craven Fear had so particularly pointed out to her. On arriving there, just as darkness fell, she found that though the path had indeed broken right away, a plank had been laid across the gap, and a rope placed through iron rings in the rock face to form a handrail which she could cling to as she walked across the narrow bridge. The Hart and the Hind, of course, had disdained such unnecessary assistance and just leaped across it, making it look as though there was nothing there. However, even with the handrail to steady her, Much Afraid was very careful to close her imagination altogether to the picture which Craven Fear had painted. From bitter experience, she knew that pictures thrown on the screen of her imagination could seem much more unnerving and terrible than the actual facts. When the plank was crossed safely, and they discovered themselves to be in an exceedingly narrow gorge, quite invisible from below, directly facing them was the very resting place that the shepherd had spoken of, a little cave where they were to rest for the night. With a sense of great relief and thankfulness, she went inside and looked around. Its situation was such that though she could not look down into the dizzy depths beneath, It was possible to look right out over the plateau and the desert to the far-off sea. The moon had just risen and was shedding a pure silver light over everything, and the first stars appeared like faint flickers in the darkening sky. In the cave itself, flat rocks had been placed to form rude seats and a table. On the ground at one side were piled sheepskins on which they could rest. Not far from the cave entrance, a tiny waterfall trickled down the cliff, and they went to it in turn and refreshed themselves. Then sorrow and suffering produced 2 packages of bread and dried fruits and nuts, which the shepherd had given them at the foot of the ascent. With these, they gladly satisfied their hunger, and then, overcome by weakness, laid themselves down in the cave and fell into dreamless slumber. Much Afraid woke with the first light of dawn, and getting up, walked to the entrance of the cave. In the cold light of early morning, she could not help telling herself that a scene of utter desolation lay before her. As far as the eye could see, there was nothing but empty plain and sea, with lowering cliffs above her, jagged rock below. The pleasant wooded country which they had left was out of sight, and in all the vast area upon which she looked was not one single tree or bush. How desolate, thought Much Afraid. And those rocks beneath look cruel indeed, as if they were waiting to injure and destroy anything which falls upon them. It seems as though nothing can grow anywhere in this barren waste. Just then she looked up at the cliffs above her head, and started with surprise and delight. In a tiny crevice of the rock, where a few drops of the trickling waterfall could occasionally sprinkle, was a single plant. It had just 2 or 3 leaves and one fragile stem, almost hair-like in its slenderness, grew right out of the wall. On the stem was one flower, blood red in color, which glowed like a lamp or flame of fire in the early rays of the sun. Much Afraid stared at it for some moments, noticing the wall which completely imprisoned it. The minute aperture through which it had forced its way into the light and through the barren loneliness of its surroundings. Its roots were clamped around by sheer rock, its leaves scarcely able to press outside the prison house. Yet it had insisted on bursting into bloom, and was holding its little face open towards the sun, and burning like a flame of joy. As she looked up at it, Much Afraid asked, as she had in the desert, "What is your name, little flower? For indeed, I never saw another one like you." At that moment, the sun touched the blood-red petals so that they shone more vividly than ever, and a little whisper rustled from the leaves. "My name is Bearing the Cost, but some call me Forgiveness." Then Much Afraid recalled the words of the shepherd. On the way up the precipice, you will discover the next letter in the alphabet of love. Begin to practice it at once. She gazed at the little flower and again said, "Why call you that?" Once more, a little whispering laugh passed through the leaves, and she thought she heard them say, "I was separated from all my friends, exiled from my home, carried here and imprisoned in this rock. It was not my choice, but the work of others who, when they had dropped me here, went away and left me to bear the results of what they had done. I have borne and have not fainted. I have not ceased to love, and love helped me push through the crack in the rock until I could look right out onto my love, the sun himself. See now, there is nothing whatsoever between my love and my heart, nothing around to distract me from him. He shines upon me and makes me to rejoice, and has atoned to me for all that was taken from me and done against me. There is no more flower in all the world more blessed or satisfied than I, for I look up to him as a weaned child and say, whom have I in heaven but thee? And there is none upon earth that I desire but thee. Much Afraid looked at the glowing flame above her head, and a longing which almost envy leaped into her heart. She knew what she must do. Kneeling on the narrow path beneath the imprisoned flower, she said, O Lord, behold me. I am thy little handmaiden, bearing the cost. At that moment, a fragrance of the rock which imprisoned the roots of the flower above her loosened and fell at her feet. She picked it up and put it very gently with the other 7 stones in her purse and returned to the cave. Sorrow and Suffering were waiting for her with a further supply of bread, raisins, and nuts, and after they had given thanks and eaten, they roped themselves together again and continued up the precipice. After a little they came to a place which was very steep and slippery. Suddenly, Much Afraid had her first fall, and cut herself quite badly on the pieces of jagged rock which had tripped her. It was a good thing she had so securely roped herself to her companions, for a great terror came upon her, and she had become so giddy and faint that had she not been tied, she might have slipped over the edge of the path and been dashed to pieces on the rocks below. As this thought struck her, she was so overcome with panic and trembling that was all she could do was to crouch against the wall of rock and cry out to her companions that she was fainting and in terror of falling. Immediately, Sorrow, who was in front, tightened the rope, and Suffering came up to her, put her arms around her, and said urgently, "Drink some of the cordial which the shepherd gave you." Much Afraid was so faint and frightened, she could only lie in the arms of Suffering and gasp, "I don't know where the bottle is. I can't even move to fumble for it." Then Suffering herself put her hand into the clothes of the fainting girl, drew out the bottle, and poured a few drops between her lips. After a few moments, the color returned to Much Afraid's cheeks, and the faintness began to pass off, but still she could not move. She took more of the spirit of comfort and grace, and began to feel strengthened. Then Sorrow, who had come back to the place where she was crouching, gently shortened the rope so that Much Afraid could take her hand again, and they started the climb. In the fall, however, Much Afraid had cut both knees so severely that she could only limp forward very painfully, moaning continually, halting constantly. Her companions were very patient, but her progress was so slow that finally it became necessary that they would have to make greater speed, or they would not reach the top of the precipice before nightfall, and there was no other cave they could rest. At last, Suffering stooped over her and asked, "Much Afraid, what were you doing when you left the cave this morning and went off by yourself?" Much Afraid gave her a startled look, and then said with a painful flush, "I was looking at a flower which I had not seen before, growing in the rock by the waterfall." "What flower was that?" persisted Suffering very gently. "It was the flower of bearing the cost," replied Much Afraid, "but some call it forgiveness." For a few moments she was silent, remembering the altar she had built and realizing she was not practicing this new love and difficult letter of the alphabet of love. Then she said, I wonder if it would help my knees if we put a few drops of the cordial on them. Let us try, said Sorrow and Suffering both together. It is an excellent suggestion. As they dropped a little of the cordial on both knees, almost at once the bleeding ceased, and the worst of the smart and pain died away. Her legs remained very stiff, and she was still obliged to limp quite badly, but they did go forward at a much better pace. By late afternoon, they were right at the top of the awful ascent, and found themselves in a forest of young pine trees, with moss and blueberries growing on the banks beside the path, and the precipice, which had looked so impassable, was actually behind them. They sat down on one of the mossy banks in the wood to rest, then heard a voice singing quite close at hand. And the voice sang, Thou art all fair, my dearest love, there is no spot in thee. Come with me to the heights above, yet fairer visions see. Up to the mount of myrrh and thence, across the hills of frankincense, to where the dawn's clear innocence bids all the shadows flee. Come with me, O my fairest dear, with me to Lebanon. Look from the peaks of grim Shanir, Amana and Hermon. The lions have their dens up there, the leopards prowl the glens up there, but from the top the view is clear, of land yet to be won. There, coming toward them through the clearing in the trees, was the shepherd himself. And that is the end of the chapter. I hope you have a great day.